I founded a digital agency back in 1995 called Obsolete. So I've kind of been in the digital world for a very long time, which turned into another company called Lateral, which I sold in 2009 to a bunch of wankers. That I will go into great depth with years later on about why. And for the last 2 years, Lateral was basically about 30-odd sort of mid-sized digital agency. We had clients like Levi's, Channel 5, RSPCA, Nintendo, Sega, also quite big blue chip clients, but we were actually very small. But we had a size cap of 30 people, generally floated around 25 to 30, and that was because the way the company was manufactured, the way we made it, the reason it was called Lateral was actually it was all about collaboration. It was instead of actually having build something really massive, it was actually build relationship with peers so that we could actually scale up and scale down accordingly, not outsourcing, genuinely peering. In around 2000, I met Ian as I was setting up a thing called The Cluster in what is now Silicon Ditch or Tech City or whatever the fuck it's called in Shoreditch. And we pulled together about 20 different tiny little independent agencies who were all ostensibly competing with each other, but actually, when we all got in a room together, the idea was it was a bit like Alcoholics Anonymous, where you came in, you shared your experiences with the clients, and it was covered quite a broad spectrum of digital, from development all the way through marketing and PR. And that was in the sort of deep dark days of the first crash. Over the last 2 years since I got out of Lateral, and it's just basically the first time I haven't had staff since I was 19. So in terms of being an entrepreneur, I guess I qualify, but I've never thought, I hate the word, and just kind of fell into stuff, along the way. Now that there's a form of methodology for what you call it, but the first thing I wanted to do was actually go out and put together a cluster-like thing with my mates in London. Went and talked to lots of people, and as the evening goes on, I'll talk more about that and what I found in terms of collaboration. So that's kind of my day job is I consult doing. I mentor a lot of startups, actually, part of a couple of collectives down south, doing sort of non-exec work, sort of teaching people how to build stuff, and I get corporate cash when I consult doing digital planning and strategy, and quite a lot of sort of analog to digital conversion thing. So that's me.
Sorry, Tom, what was the name of that you do now?
It doesn't. Well, it's got a bunch of names. I mean, this is the thing. I've deliberately not run a certain other company. So each sort of collective wheel has its own name. So the mentoring thing is called Citizen Guild. One of the sort of larger groups is called N, which is all about the power of N. So it's all of us, power of N, working together. I spent so much time sort of building an agency brand. The last thing I wanted to do was actually build another brand. It's all about the people I'm working with. So that's fun. Yeah, I can give the contact details basically.
I'm Francis Irving. I'm one of the people who started a non-profit tech startup, which was called My Society. It started in 2003. We did lots of stuff making democracy more usable, making sites like They Work For You and Fix My Street. And more recently, I'm not really an entrepreneur because I never started a company. I've been the founder, the person who had to take the very, very initial risk. I now run Scraper Wiki, which was founded by a couple of friends of mine who still run it with me. And we're much more a classic kind of a for-profit Silicon Valley type business. We're open source, and I'm not sure what the sense you mean open source entrepreneurship here is. We're open source in the sense that the stuff we make is open source, like the source code is available for anyone to take and reuse. But we sell services, both hosting it and the central place of being the community where the software is run, and we sell also other things on top of it. So there's this general thing of open source in its original meaning being used as a weapon, which we'll maybe come back to later. It's actually very aggressive to use open source in business. In terms of openness, the thing I feel like like, let's say, is how many people here have ever signed an NDA because someone they sort of knew, an acquaintance, wanted to show them a business idea that they had, and they made them sign an NDA.
What's an NDA?
Non-disclosure agreement.
I've been asked to sign
Literally not with the paper
Yeah.
it's written.
Well, so that's what I was going to say. And of those people, how many of those people, the person you signed the NDA for, did their business plan succeed?
No.
No. So,
Julian. Yes.
excellent. I have. Oh, it's Julian. Hello.
Sorry, everybody.
Yeah. So I've found that universally, if someone tries to be secretive about a business idea, that pretty well means it's going to fail, because the hard part of starting a business is not some idea, it's actually executing, finding other people, making them passionate about it, delivering it. So there's no reason to really keep anything quiet, and lots of reasons to talk about more things that you do. There'll always be a little sliver of competitive advantage, which shouldn't be open, but everything else, open.
I'm Adrian McEwen. I've been putting things on the internet, strange things on the internet, I think, since the mid-90s. Cash registers, did the first, involved in a startup in Cambridge. We did the first ever web browser on a mobile phone in like '97. That got Microsoft's interest. They bought us in '99. So I had a couple of years at the evil empire before they decided to close us. Are they good now? I can't say a bad word about them, but that's largely because I signed a bit of paper when I left. I can't say a bad word about them.
That's the word covenant.
Yeah, which I think says much worse things than I'd ever have said about them. So actually, it's been a bit of an own goal for them.
And actually, the people who bought us were not wankers, because I signed one of them as well.
So since 2002, I've been doing my own thing. Down in Cambridge initially, and then moved back up to Liverpool in 2008 because I wanted to kind of come back kind of home. I grew up sort of 15 miles away, and kind of help Liverpool's burgeoning kind of tech scene and stuff, because there's loads of interesting stuff happening here. And do what I can to try and help that. So these days I run MCQN Limited, which is an Internet of Things consultancy and product company. The Internet of Things being this kind of growing movement to start embedding the internet into all sorts of stuff. So on like one end of the scale, it's bubble machines that are connected to Twitter that blow bubbles every time you mention Does Liverpool down in our building in Goslin's building. Or the other end, it's kind of a load of sensors inside a chicken food silo that measures how much food's left in the silo, and then they can know when to send another lorry load full of chicken food out to fill it up. So some of it kind of quite fun, some of it quite sort of industrial, but it's this whole kind of growing area. And hopefully there'll be, I'll be helping to bootstrap other companies as well doing that sort of thing in Liverpool, and we can make it into a bit of a kind of hotspot for it. There are a couple of other IoT companies around in the area already now, so it's kind of starting to get some traction. It'll be interesting to see what happens. And I guess in the whole like helping other companies side of things, I'm also one of the organisers of a group called Does Liverpool. So we've got an office in Goslin's building on Hanover Street, and it's a kind of shared office, shared workshop sort of area. So there are just a load of little tech companies and freelancers kind of either getting a desk or coming in hot desking, and there are events on to kind of help people, I don't know, learn new things and network as well, but the networking is not like networking events. It's like there are events and you can meet other people at them, in which case it's kind of networking, I suppose. But it's usually more about what you're learning rather than kind of going there just to meet people. And we've got a laser cutter and a 3D printer and things like that, so people can kind of come and play with some of these new tools of the digital fabrication.
Tea and coffee.
Tea and coffee, yes.
Right, I'm Julian Tate, the late Julian Tate. I just arrived, Julian Tate. I'm based in Manchester. I'm very much involved with setting up collaborative networks, and as part of my time I work with an organisation called Future Everything. So I 3.5 years ago co-founded a social media cafe with a guy called Martin Bryant, and I'm involved with open data stuff, development of Greater Manchester Data Store. Quite involved with Manchester Digital Laboratory or MadLab, which is a similar space to DOS, which is a fantastic community space, and involved with quite a few communities that actually work out there. interested in how what were once siloed communities are starting to work together, because there's very few people who are actually in a solo discipline anymore. It's kind of that they tend to have interests that pass over into all different forms. This was quite impactful on me. In 2007, I created a platform for the delivery of location-aware media content. It was selected for the Galileo Masters programme, but one of the problems was I couldn't find the right people to work on it. And so the idea kind of so far was feted and then kind of disappeared because there weren't those networks available, so I could talk to people who were kind of programmers, like source programmers, mobile programmers, and work in a collaborative way. So I'm very much of that kind of collaboration and co-production is the way forward, especially in an open and enlightened way.
Cool. Okay, this is part of the Global Entrepreneurship Conference, a fringe event of. Entrepreneurship seems to be quite trendy, as lean startup stuff, and those kind of that kind of language of entrepreneurship, the language of startup, sort of has become quite this very exciting general culture at the moment, and the people and the success of yesterday kind of proves that. But in what ways is entrepreneurship kind of cool, and in other ways is it just like a new word for stuff we've always been doing and perhaps gets in the way? I expect that badly, didn't I? It's always better in my own notebook.
Is there something actually happening, or is it just another question?
Yeah, entrepreneurship. Yeah. What do we think? Yeah.
It was always there, and it will always be there. People will always come up with ideas and they make things. However, at the moment there is just so much interest that it's hard not to. I mean, everybody here has no doubt either had an idea or had somebody come up to them with, "I've got this great idea for X." And at the moment, the wonderful thing that's going on in the digital space, really, the thing that had this confluence of interests of social, mobile, and location-based. And so I don't know what I've been making a percentage, but like 80-odd, 90-odd% of things I hear about are all fall broadly into the app category or social, social engagement or social retail or something like that. So and it's relatively uncharted, in that it still feels like there's an awful lot more things to do. So I think that's why we're entrepreneurial is actually now is a very good time to be doing that, especially in recession. So.
Is it just that some of it's kind of like the costs of being an entrepreneur dropped as well? I think that's why you get a lot of the
around like this.
That's so you can throw things out. Because it feels like with some of the startup things, and some of it's to do with the fact that you can basically throw up a website and reach lots of people without having to spend very much, which I think is helping kind of in the tech side at least.
Yeah. Also the cloud stuff. Basically the fact that you can have an enterprise-grade infrastructure for virtually nothing, is based on usage, is huge as well. Because I think there's a lot more opportunities to actually do things which back in the day we just couldn't even think of because we couldn't afford the servers.
Is there a difference between innovation and entrepreneurship? Because I sometimes think they get kind of confused, because an entrepreneur is somebody who almost like exploits an idea or a solution to a given need or a problem, whereas innovation is working out how to do things differently or more effectively, almost for our own needs in a way, but also for wider society. But I do think they do get conflated, and I think that entrepreneurship is almost like trying to take something as far as it will go. And it's almost, I do feel like it can be a little bit faddish. You see lots of these tech startup type clubs that happen around, which tend to become, what I found has kind of become very marketeer type based, looking for new ideas to perhaps exploit it. And I do think there is a slight difference.
Is that a bad thing?
Well, I think I'm a little bit uneasy with it in a way, because it's almost like almost feel like entrepreneurship is a pure exploitation of something, whereas innovation is more of a iterative process. Perhaps I'm getting confused with that.
See, the sense in which I don't agree with that is when you have an innovation, a key part of that, usually people think of making a product or making some technology, but a fundamental key part of that, particularly in this kind of quite social global world now, is getting that product to market. Like having developed its market is very different than the product is. So you can just try and invent something in your own head or in your own lab, but if it's not actually being used by lots of people, then it's not. There's flaws in the original invention as well. You can't just blame that. Oh, we made this better mousetrap and no one found it. That's not really a good excuse anymore.
Well, yeah. Yes, no. It all depends on. I think it comes down to what your objective is. You know, and I read something recently. And it was on one of the VC's blogs, and it was basically saying that actually, what's going on in the States right now is actually nothing to do with entrepreneurialism. It's actually glorified HR. It's recruitment.
Yeah.
So you basically, if you you get your 50 grand off Y Combinator, you build something, build a better mousetrap.
Yeah.
Nobody uses it. Right?
Yeah.
The fact is that actually, when they do use it, you can't afford it. You can't afford to pay for the patents anymore. So it's actually a really dangerous world to actually do tech startups, because somebody's going to come along and say, "You've used our drop-down menu. I want £1 million." So that's why they buy it. You know, it's quicker. It's easier just to buy core tech and be. So
there's something very interesting, especially with Y Combinator, happened today. They did a release about where they wanted people to approach them who don't even have an idea, which almost kind of, I think, is this the end? Is it? Are we coming to the stage where you don't actually have to have an idea to approach a VC company for them to invest in you? I mean, as you say, that is HR. And I think is this kind of this idea of web entrepreneurship, which is a very kind of, I do think it is a little bit, it feeds on itself to a degree. Are we starting to reach a plateau with regards to that?
Again, it comes down to motivation. If you actually want to run a business, and running a business that comes, with a hell of a lot of strings attached, in that, it's not. Then this is where I think it differs from innovation, because actually, innovation doesn't necessarily drive big business. Being the first is actually generally not the way to make lots of money. It's actually being second or third, and it's iterating and actually get. Today I was playing around with Spin Cam. Come across that yet? I think it was launched at South by Southwest. I've got to show you. Do a demonstration. And so what you do,
tissue.
Literally, it does exactly what it says on the tin.
It's exciting, but it's not bad.
Is that a review? We'll start with you.
Eyes I can freeze you.
That's what it does.
Panoramic picture.
Makes you more
Just pass it, just swipe.
I said panoramic picture.
That's it.
And that's what it does. And it makes panoramic shots. That's what it does. And it's great. I mean, everybody's seen this sort of stuff since QuickTime VR back in the day, but actually being able to do it like that, in terms of disruption, totally changes the real estate business. Right? If I want to go and shoot a house, I can now just go stand in the middle, do that. You've got already a bunch of folk using it, doing Matrix type stuff. So and they just run around. And it's great. And it's got about 5 minutes, and somebody's going to buy them just for the tech and integrate it into a Pinterest, or more likely a Facebook or one of the bigger guys. They have no business model.
They're a feature, not a company.
Huh?
They're a feature, not a company.
Yeah. It's a cool thing. It's a brilliant idea waiting for somebody to buy it. And they had 200,000 users in 4 days, and probably another 10 now. But that's not building a business. That's actually just chucking something out. And
it test the market as well. With the apps online, you can as well test the market and maybe some people obviously if they got some mistake and they might send like, yeah, you should do this or do that, and like have more feedback.
Well, just checking.
Yeah, because if they put it already online and if they don't have money and
it could be a bootstrapping thing, yeah.
But it's the kind of situation.
These guys had cash. I didn't actually. I mean, it looks expensive. It works as a minimum viable product, right? It does exactly what it's supposed to do. But a bit like, did you cut colour last year?
Yeah.
You know, because colour was $41 million thrown down the drain because nobody actually.
That's the tip of the iceberg. They've spent about less than 0.1% of it. They've not spent a lot of their budget.
Well, colour.
Yeah.
Not what I read.
Well, they've got a lot of money left.
Yeah. It's all bust. The guys now doing something else, and they've just worked on technology. But,
okay, so they've reversed it out to the investors because they didn't spend all that money on that.
No, they spent a lot.
But there's a thing about collaboration around staging events there, though, because maybe it was 4 years ago, was it 3 years ago, that Foursquare and GoWeller went out South by Southwest, and it was in Wired, and it was almost trailed as like the Blur versus Oasis, the location-specific apps. Right? They knew that they both benefit from both being there, but only one of them was going to win out. So there was a kind of calculated risk they'd both make more money. So there's a weird kind of open source entrepreneurial collaboration between two guys who are being set up as being direct opposition to each other. It was absolutely clear that they were both completely in on this as a way of marketing their businesses. And it's actually, from a perspective of the Liverpool environment, the Manchester environment, it's probably something that we should think about doing with companies more often, and actually doing stunts and throwing things out like that that just bring what's going on to the attention. I mean, there's a sense in which you can't stop Liverpool versus Manchester, so maybe we should use it a bit more.
I think to get the games away from London is a huge task, and I'm sure everybody who's kind of had meetings down in London, it's almost as if this kind of, well, if it's any good, you'll be based here. You kind of. I had a meeting with Ben Hammersley from Wired, and he was like, if it wasn't in the Silicon Roundabout, it didn't really exist. I mean, that was only thing. These are the major tech they have a lot of influence as far as the tech scene in this country is concerned. And I do find that, I think anything that would help the gays kind of moving north, and I think there's had difficulties in the northeast as well with that as well, and perhaps.
It's actually very counterintuitive from our office was in Shoreditch before it was called looking at that and all that, but we were there right at the start, but you'd be surprised that it's actually really kind of dull. I mean, there's a few pubs that a few folk drink in. It's more used as a recruitment. I mean, it's not. It was never actually the community that everybody thought it was, even when it was the community that everybody thought it was. And the idea of actually being honed there is not cost effective. If you're actually trying to build a business, you actually don't want it there because it actually got really expensive. It's why the games industry moved out of London a long time ago. It did actually, if you think of all the the games industry in the UK, apart from maybe Media Molecule, most of it's elsewhere. So they just like it because they don't have to travel very far. I mean, the VCs like it because actually it's just there. And you can,
but arguably, arguably on the point that you're talking about, you're concerned about the general concept of entrepreneurialism and how it's self-referencing. I mean, presumably that exists more in London than it does anywhere else because it's a closed community, and that's where you get this autopoietic self-referencing nature. So potentially, if you like, that's offering great opportunity to us in the north.
Yeah.
That very thing you described.
Right with the whole kind of feeling. I'm not sure if it's necessarily innovation versus entrepreneurial. I mean, to some extent, I'd be, almost arguing that innovation is just last year's buzzword and entrepreneurs this year's buzzword, and neither of them really matter that much. What's important is kind of building value, and it's kind of like coming back to Tim O'Reilly's kind of create more value than you kind of steal and you capture, and looking into doing stuff that's bigger, and so you get beyond all of the look, can we build a Facebook game that goes viral and then we'll make lots of money. And the world is a better place for the fact there's another Facebook game out there. building stuff that's more important, more interesting, and then you've got like, it is harder and it takes longer, which is the tricky bit. But
I mean, there was that kind of feeling that, I mean, especially with what's happening. Was it Greg Kawasaki who had this real Guy Kawasaki, who's this kind of I don't know how to.
He's a VC guru, dude.
He's
the guy that originally got the whole world believing Apple was magical. He's the magic guy.
Yeah.
And he's the one who promoted it. And he goes around the whole thing was going around smiling and being happy about Apple and getting everybody in the journalistic community loving them.
Harry's a great type of evangelist, isn't he?
Yeah. But he had a real kind of almost like a meltdown last year. I think it was in October about the entrepreneur culture in Silicon Valley and how it was becoming such a bubble that it was just kind of it was shallow. There wasn't this idea of value wasn't being created, but everybody thought.
I think bundling entrepreneur as one collectible group is kind of ludicrous. There are entrepreneurs who are trying to add social good, and they're going to look at the way their payoff isn't money. They want to be self-sustaining. Their payoff is to achieve things they want to achieve, and that's their bottom line. And there are entrepreneurs who are, like you say, they're in the HR game. They're really trying to say, look what a great engineer I am. Please hire me, Google. Or even better, please hire me if you're a pre-IPO company that's going somewhere, because I want to get a real payoff. So that is the HR thing. They're not entrepreneurs, they're features, not products. But those guys have proven they can do something that might be useful to something. You're right. But it's not all entrepreneurs. There are entrepreneurs who are going to rip your face off. They're going to do anything they can to get money out of you, and they don't care. I mean, you could say some of the businesses, anyone can get a massively turnaround business selling tenors for £5. You could argue Groupon, a company selling tenors for £5, but even better, they got someone else to sell their tenors for £5, then took £3 off them to let them do it. So they didn't even have to sell their own tenants for £5. That's their business. It's not a sustainable business, is it?
One of the things I was looking at last year when I was going around trying to sort of pull together all these companies was discovering that anybody who calls themselves an entrepreneur, by the way, is by definition an alpha. You know, they've got there's an attitude there which can be problematic because they actually believe they're more important than everybody else. And when you try and get a bunch of people together to collaborate, and essentially what you've got is a whole bunch of alphas, right, in a room, and understanding the motivation of why people what people are trying to achieve. What I found was it's absolutely brilliant. So when you've got a real shark, a real, 10 for a fiver kind of, that.
Oh, the shark, I mean.
As long as
no, you're right.
As long as you know that, if you're thinking about getting, working with other people, especially if you're starting to work across industries, because I think it's really important that actually people understand outside the development world and outside the purely digital world, some of their skills, especially on the commercial side. If you understand what people's motivations are, then it actually makes it very easy to collaborate with them, because you know where you're going to get stabbed in the back, because it's the nature of the beast. You just have that. If you're going to be doing what they're doing, if you're not open and upfront about what your objectives are, I think it's totally cool to say I'm going to do SpinCam if I'll get 2 billion in 2 months, and the rest of you be damned. But if say I want to build a business for X amount of time, or I want to, an exit in this way, but I mean, I think looking to get into any collaborative relationship, whether it's an individual or an organisation, understanding where they want, and then actually reviewing that every year, because that changes. Year 1, everybody's really excited about things. Year 2, you're starting to think, well, is this ever going to go anywhere? Year 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, after that, people change. But I just think it's knowing what you're getting into.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's exactly right. I just think that using any of these terms as a catch-all. I mean, innovation is taking an invention and commercialising it, or getting what you're understanding and show entrepreneurialism. So some of the things that are being hyped up, I get to talk about Lean last time, mostly as an introduction, but most of that is trying to bring engineering rigour to the process of entrepreneurship, so you don't waste a lot of time, so you can get the feedback actually on data and not just put your finger in the air. But that's to try and build long-term sustainable businesses. That's for someone who's really interested in trying to get their business set up so that they can do things quickly, and to get feedback quickly, and to adjust their company quickly, to grow it for the long term. Are people going to use these tools to do things quick? And are there going to be some entrepreneurs who are just going to be there to rip someone's face off? Yes. But there's going to be lots of entrepreneurs who are there, who are entrepreneurs, who are trying to really make some effective, positive change in the world. And I'm seeing more and more people who are in that camp as well growing.
I think I've been in conversations when you've had possible investors actually saying, because obviously certain investors will want to see their investment obviously grow, and they'll have and they're kind of working towards an exit, and say, well, within 3 years we think this will be valued to a certain extent, and you know that they're not interested really in your
the VCs want that, they want
yeah.
that.
And the thing is, to get a lot of investment, you have to go down that route.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People who complain about it when they do get turned over, that's kind of
to a VC, that's their finely engineered version of the business that you've been describing. It's just they're working with different tools. I'm kind of intrigued by Francis's statement that open source is a very aggressive way to run your business. You said something about open source is a very aggressive tool to use in business.
Should I answer that?
Yeah, that'd be great, actually.
Yeah, so this is the other way around. This isn't so much the open source of entrepreneurship, but using, opening up things about your internal workings, your source code, your data center designs, your business model, your staff salaries. There are all sorts of things potentially that you could publish in public about a business. Historically, the rule has been don't publish anything, keep everything secret, then you're more likely to win. As time passes, that just becomes an increasingly stupid thing to do because there's lots of reasons for that. One is that if you keep something yourself, you have to look after it yourself, improve it and maintain it yourself, so there's a cost to doing it. The other is that that's a key one. The other main one is that you use the chance to disrupt competitors who are fighting along that direction. So the obvious examples are really big ones with tech giants, but I suspect it applies less so to small, newer companies. So, for example, Google made a mobile phone operating system that's deliberately open source from their point of view, so that mobile phone companies were happy to use it in volume and use it to try and stop hive off Apple having a closed source kind of mobile phone platform. And that is deliberately Google very aggressively using open source as a weapon against Apple. They're basically going, you're making all your money from selling this proprietary thing, so we're going to take a key part of it and make it available free to everyone to destroy your business and to reduce your market share. Another good example that I quite like is one that's against Google, which is Facebook opened the designs of their data centers, so how the computers stack up and how the cooling units work for their data centers. And before that, Google, in theory, had a competitive advantage because they were very good and they had very well designed their own proprietary data centers that are incredibly efficient in terms of hardware and how they're assembled and maintained. So Facebook went and did the same kind of design process, but then decided it wasn't anything to do with their competitive advantage, and they open sourced that. And then other people who are starting a data center can now come and help them. Other startups could go and look and go, that's inefficient, I can sell you something Facebook to make it more efficient. It opens things out. And it goes beyond just that kind of data, it can be quite core data. So Nike, of all companies, the trainer company, are open sourcing stuff. The one they did some years ago was the locations of their factories, so they could get human rights activists to help them check that the labour conditions were good within factories. Because they didn't want, partly because they didn't want the bad PR, because they had bad PR in the 90s from that, and partly because they wanted to, partly because they didn't want PR, and partly because they didn't want their supply disrupted by problems, because it's always better to have a reasonable conditions in factories. And then now they've hired the guy who invented the wiki, Will Cunningham, to do more open data things. And I'm told they'll be doing stuff like opening data about their cotton supply chain, because cotton to them, again, it's a commodity. It's not core to their competitive advantage. Their competitive advantage is trainer designs and their brand, probably actually just their brand, to be honest. So they're completely irrelevant to them where the cotton comes from. They just want cheap, reliable cotton. And they're extremely worried that we've reached peak cotton and that the price of cotton is only going to go up because of water shortages, basically worldwide, and agricultural land shortages. So they're opening their supply chain data about cotton because they want to change to recycling cotton. And they can't do it on their own because their suppliers also supply their competitors. So they and their competitors have to simultaneously change the whole supply chain of cotton in a very fundamental way. And they think that they can help encourage that by giving information to other startups, information to other businesses, by releasing data about their cotton supply. And that traditionally is not something that you do at all. It's certainly not something Apple would do now, say, because Apple have a massive advantage in their supply chain. So it's a different, according to your business, there'll be different things you can be open about and different things you can be closed about.
To be fair, Apple actually has done that. It's just that they've got their competitive advantages. They've got so much cash, they've bought the whole of this.
Yes, but in other areas,
so nobody can actually get a look at them.
Their browser is open source, for example. So they have.
No, I just thought it's hilarious that Samsung had just made the Retina display for the iPad 3, the new iPad, and because it's taking up so much of their resources, Samsung couldn't actually make their own. Even though they made it, they couldn't actually create a tablet with that screen on it, because Apple has basically bought up all of their production capabilities on that. Apple just have scale. But I think just rewinding to less global things like I was thinking this morning about templates for things, and any startup, anybody who's looking for business, you're going to go through a business planning process to a greater or lesser extent, whether it's the Guy Kawasaki route, which, by the way, you should look up Guy Kawasaki's 10-20-30 rule on writing a business plan. It's great. It's 10 slides, 20 minutes tops, with a minimum of 30-point type, or half the age of the oldest person. The font size has to be half the age of the oldest person in the room. Right? And it's incredibly good discipline. Right, to have 10 slides, which actually get, and he says what goes on those slides as well, and I've actually used that quite a lot. It's just great if you can get across an idea, that quickly. Because people have a tendency to write these massively complicated blah, and of course most VCs aren't interested in that. But things like that, where you're actually going through a business planning process, if you know a bunch of other people going through the same process, you can be doing it together, and actually putting out those things which are not secret. Business planning is virtually worthless because it's all about the execution anyway. And when it comes down to, if you have to do the traditional one of finding the research is really hard to find. If you're looking at a specific audience, and techies probably don't go through that process, but if you want to say, yes, I'm looking at 18 to 34-year-old men living in the north, their consumption habits are this, and therefore I think I can screw that much money out of them, right? Most of us don't have access to that, but if you do, if you collaborate, if you, together, or if you go and love bomb a media agency, they've got this data. So actually finding out, or you through open data as well, there's more stuff. But there's a lot of little things which actually people will be sitting in a more often than not a bedroom or a home studio, trying to write this stuff out, where you should all be working on each other's plans, and especially when it comes to business models. There's about 8, if you're doing a digital startup, you hear about the same 5, 6, 7, 8 models. So it's ad funded, yeah, right. Okay, it's self-funded. Oh, it's in-app purchases. It's we're doing affiliate deals off of blah. We're just going to build it and sell the tech. There's only so many different models. I don't think there's been a new one in a while. I think free-to-play has been the last big one. Join resources, get the spreadsheets together, actually look at what you're doing, look at what they're doing, and say, well, actually, you still all have to make money. The other thing is looking at, if you are doing something which is brand funded, look at combining resources in terms of ad sales. Finding instead of having one person going and phoning up brands, saying, will you invest X amount, I think why don't you get a bunch of folks together, you can look at cross-selling within your own applications and your own things. So just lots of things which used to be very, very closed, commercially sensitive, which now, frankly, if you don't, it just means that it takes a hell of a lot longer to get things done. And together you can actually do it. Sorry, Brian.
What was also interesting is this idea that if you have traditional business advice, it's always down to they keep hitting. I was always hit with IP. You've got to protect IP, and you find that as a startup or a small business, that is prohibitively expensive. To actually protect your own IP is prohibitively expensive, and actually the process of doing that, it takes a long time. And actually this idea which you get in lean startups is almost like being first to market. If you're first to market, then you have that competitive edge. I think is starting to become more accepted now. Whereas you can still get laboured in business advice that will still kind of say about what is the IP, what is the patent.
But it's I mean, I spent most of my life actually reading things about copyright and patents. And the problem now is that there's so many patents out there that pretty much anything fits into any bucket. That as soon as somebody wants to actually try and screw you, you know, I mean, have you looked at what what Yahoo is trying to sue Facebook over? It's just come out in the last couple of days. So Yahoo is suing Facebook, saying that Facebook wouldn't exist if it basically if Yahoo hadn't done all these patents. And the things like having two people talk together on combined with a web interface. I mean, it's really, really naughty stuff.
Yeah.
So there's great. It's well worth reading actually. If you ever read Falkinger's info, it's a guy who's hired at Python. It's grown quite a lot since he left. And Falkinger, Rick Falkinger. He's got a lot of people writing. This is the patent in a UK example, and it costs 50,000 quid to register a patent. Right, but before quid. Right, and that'll take about 6 months. To defend a patent costs on average $40. Right, to defend it. So, but they don't hit you with one; they hit you with multiple. So that's 4 million times. And it's just going through. And the whole thing is, patents. So patents were there to sort of help spur innovation. Right, that was the original idea to make your money idea. Now they're to cripple. That's 4 million quid.
And it's also because we could do this way.
Because we could just see
so
it.
Just give it to us for a little bit of change.
And watching Kodak sue Apple, right? You know, Kodak going down. I didn't know they joined led to camera. Right? Did you know that? Yeah. So they quickly this big hobby. It looked a lot like a. It was like a. What is it was
like a big thing though.
But it turned out they joined now. The two companies actually own all the patents around digital imaging. You know, you've never heard Apple suing anybody around that, but of course Kodak is now bust, and they're trying to kill this. I mean, they only keep the patents just for when. Actually, you can tell when the company's screwed actually because they get the patents out.
But that's I mean, the point that Julian's making is about the shortfalls of business advice, because in the absence of any capital asset for the bank to reclaim, Bob, the ex-bank manager, who's now a business advisor, is struggling to find why anybody would lend this company money to grow itself. So they latch onto IP as the only marginally tangible thing that they could possibly have.
He actually said it earlier on, which is correct, which is if you want to build a business, you build an audience. Because an audience is yours. Nobody can mess with that. You know, that's your competitive advantage. If you can actually grow yourself an audience, the technology actually falls into the background, because you know things like Pinterest, technologically actually isn't that interesting, but when you've got hundreds of millions of people using it, that's what you're investing in. And so, from a brand perspective, from an advertising, from a business model, it's all about are people using it really? You know, is the other way to do it, and that's how you make multi, you know,
Just
millions. So.
Just going back to the point of view of a startup, well, actually in my case a very recent startup. I mean, what I want to do is just make enough money to survive after August. You know, I've got money coming in from various bits of work till August, and I'm building that slowly. And one of the reasons why I started how to make a success of what I'm doing is because of the information from Liverpool. So going to the events, run my does Liverpool, I'm meeting the people there, you know, and that
it's nothing to do with me. It's all about the people. It's all about the people that do it. I was money.
Yeah, exactly. But it was a good space which you created. But in that space, there's a whole bunch of people who are very generous with their advice and very generous with their knowledge in a way that, you know, I just didn't get from traditional. I went to a few traditional business advisors, and they weren't giving me that kind of information. And I got it from you know, you don't got vast amounts of money, have you, in order to
no, if I have, it's very well. It was completely self-funded and has been from the start, because we only locked into outputs, because I've seen everybody else locked into outputs.
So
having to do stuff in order to get to sort of twist what you want to do in order to fit into the boxes that somebody who's giving you money has got, because they said that when they got the money that they'd make all these things happen. And so basically we've been kind of, we're funded by the people who use the space, which I suppose is that whole old, like, if you're not paying for it, you're not the customer, you're the product kind of thing. And we're trying to make it so the community pays for it, because then the community is the customer, and it does what the community wants, and not what somebody else wants.
Yeah, I mean, any kind of funding from a good type of funding, it does come with those strings where it's for a strategic objective. It's not necessarily for your objective, it's for a broader strategic objective, and you're there to try and move that strategic objective forward.
And sorry, just to kind of deflate my own point, I suppose. We have had some money for certain things. So like some of the events we put on for the GC week, like some of the drinks were paid for by Acme and things like that. So there have been little times when we've got bits of cash, but our general day-to-day expenses were kind of, anybody who's tried to persuade me that we should go for funding to do something will no doubt attest, because Max will on times when he's sort of gone, you could get some money to do this, and it's like, yes we could, but then we'd have like so for the day-to-day running of it, we don't want to be taking money for that, because we want to be self-sustained, and if we can get bits of extra cash to get interesting things or put on events, stuff like that, then that's kind of useful. But to make sure that does are still there in 6 months or a year or something is more about having enough people that we're serving who are useful.
Do you people just I had a friend who's I've got this really good mate. He designs lots of interactive stuff. He's a brilliant designer, and he wants to build stuff with Arduino, which was you're on favourite. He didn't have the skills. He said, well, you should get along to MadLab. There's loads of people that help you out, and it's all about sharing and then sharing knowledge. And, I can't do that. No, I can't go in there. This is my ideas that ripped me off. And he had this idea, because he'd been working for himself for so long, he had these ideas that they were so precious, and if he shared them, somebody else would go off with them. Mm-hmm. So he'd almost like prefer to keep his ideas secret and not realise than actually share it. And it's kind of, he's kind of coming round to it now. He's been for a few nights out with some of the people who he kind of started to go.
I was working with a startup last year, and they were quite grown up. The other end of startups, they're guys who basically had their career in the 50s. You kind of get the 22-year-olds and you get the other side, and sign the NDAs and all that sort of model. And the whole thing was a social network for vertical that involves, I don't know, sports or something. And it was absolutely brilliant, because they wanted to do a social network, but they didn't want to talk about it. And so when we're talking, it really is simple as that, and it was about sports. So it's like, okay, so how exactly are you going to do this? I worked with them. I actually came up with something which would be a point of difference. That actually this, there are a few people working in this space, but not very many, and it's all amateur stuff, which is very cool. But they said, no, what we have to do is an alpha that just proves the concept that people who are amateur sports are interested in this. But that's that's a cognitive dissonance at the end. And so they did a thing on NIN. Right? And they're saying, we need to get enough folks so to go to the VCs and get the cash. I said, yeah, but doing what a NIN, or open social, or one of those free Facebook-alike type thing. So what's your point of difference? I mean, surely these people are just doing it on Facebook anyway. It doesn't actually show any great understanding of the audience. And months later, 200 folk on their closed network, and it just doesn't pay. If you've got a good idea, get out there and do it. And frankly, the people who win are the ones who get the audience in, who listen to the audience. People. I keep hearing GiftGap as a sort of big study of how social engineering. Do you know GiftGap?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because they're basically an MVNO, a mobile virtual.
Part of O2, aren't they? O2 is like a
Yeah,
test network.
But they started out basically, we're going to be a virtual mobile operator, and everything from the branding all the way through customer support. has been, it's pretty smart. I mean, well, they've done it, but no, they've done it in a very open, transparent way, but it's still big corporate stuff actually behind it. But it's good. It's worth checking out how they went about doing it. But that's not just about audience, peer collaboration. That's just about engagement with your audience.
It's quite interesting because you have this notion of the business being the community, and that's the assets of the business. Because there's certain instances. There's one I can remember, and I don't know how it's going at the moment. There's a platform called Patchbag, which is very open source. There's very kind of activist community, people creating sensors to give data into the Patchbag network, and lots of interesting information and data can be got from it. But that was sold, or was bought out by LogMeIn. I don't know how that's happening, but there was a bit of which is an American it's an American company, and it's kind of you could hear there was a little disquiet within the community of kind of, well, we respected this, we kind of grew up with this, and they felt that they had ownership over this, and in a way they were donating data to Patchbag, so in a sense they were. And then another organisation had taken it over, and there was this kind of, will they lose that community? Will that asset which was the community be lost? Because it can just go.
Didn't that happen with the Huffington Post or something similar?
They turned well. They lost a lot of their writers. Yeah. And I have to say, I mean, I'm not a big fan of Arianna Huffington, but she was always straight up. Right. In that, we have an audience. You write for us, and we'll give you an audience. We're not going to pay you for it. So it pissed off a hell of a lot of journalists. But actually, their numbers aren't terribly down. Things they're kind of trying to turn themselves into a TV channel, which now they have to do the old-fashioned way of paying people to make this stuff because nobody wants to put any more money in their pockets. So commercially, they're now just as screwed as everybody else because they have to invest in the community that build it isn't necessarily there to do it. But a lot of my mates are actually writing for the Huffington Post, and it kind of comes up quite often. It's like, aren't they a bit dodgy now? It's like, yeah, but your thing's going to be read by 3 million people.
I think
I think
so.
Do it.
Coming back to your point there, it's an awful lot of people refer to that as this functionality of environmental dynamism that has to exist, and it's very fragile. It's very different, and it's easily lost. Yeah. And that's that is really very significant. That you keep it a bit quirky, you keep it a little bit off centre, because that's the attraction to it. Really, it's the fact that it is exactly the opposite of everything that's being delivered top down.
Yeah. People aren't nearly as loyal, basically, as they think. I mean, actually, a good example of one with the Huffington Post is TechCrunch. And they got bought, and I don't know if I didn't get through the news today, but Mashable is they're talking about whether that's going to be bought by Turner, by CNN. And you build up community, you build up to a certain size, and you sell it, and then people go.
Yeah.
Off back TechCrunch, I mean, you have things like The Verge set up last year, so it's a new sort of tech blog, pretty good, and they'll build it up, and there'll always be people who move around. I think being upfront with your audience about, being transparent about what the intentions are for the business are very key. I think nobody expects anything for nothing for nothing these days. They know free is not free. And especially, I think the best thing to happen has been around the Google privacy debacle. Because what it did was it actually brought home an awful lot of things which people just didn't get. That actually they are being behaviorally tracked. They have got cookies on the machines. They're not paying for it, but they're trading their privacy.
But don't you think that's a destroyer of environmental dynamism? That is one of the destroyers.
No, I think not if you're transparent about it. I mean, otherwise, how do you pay for it? All this stuff has to be paid for.
I think there's another sort of concept that comes into play. I think you see it in environmental dynamism, and that's another fancy phrase. It's a reciprocal altruism. You actually have to give into these things, and expect something back as well, without the expect for any reward at all. Because if you do the right thing, the right thing will happen.
But, I mean,
and that's the sort of functionality.
Look at Twitter.
I
think from a tech point of view, Twitter right, should not be where it is right now. From a technology point of view, you know, there was a whole slew of companies that said, okay, we can do 256 characters. You know, the actual notion behind it, and when they started talking about how they had kill switches for countries at the end of last year, I kind of expected a lot of folks to leave, and there'd be a lot more going on. You know, in terms of, you know, but actually because they were upfront about it.
Yeah.
And frankly, you know, if Syria turns around and says
the community as well, though, because that's part of the problem with all the social stuff. Like it's like what Google Plus is kind of struggling with to some extent. They're not different enough from Twitter or Facebook, which is where everybody already is. That nobody's that bothered about going and building stuff in Google Plus because nobody knows that, and that
Pinterest
nothing
didn't know
happens.
it, and it was just a simple interaction.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting example because I think actually something very different, but not a lot of people are realising it yet.
What?
I think Google Plus is very different from Facebook. A lot of people put them as direct competitors, but Google are up to something completely different. That's not their business model.
When there used to be a platform called Jaiku, which came out. No, that's Weibo.
Jaiku was
the Finnish one.
It's Finnish,
there was a social platform that actually it kind of worked on short messages, but also it gave you some kind of depending on how many messages you sent, it kind of there's a certain kind of verifiable validation within the whole system, which kind of looked for a time as though it would actually give Twitter a certain amount for its money, then got bought by Google. I think it died last
37
year.
Signals has an interview with, like after it was bought by Google, after it died, with the founders. They've got a series on their website, on the 37 Signals website, such interviews. And there's this really depressing graph about Jaiku where basically it had like 2/3 the traffic of Twitter and was effectively its nearest competitor. This is a year before you would have heard of Twitter, like a year before you probably heard of it. And then it got bought by Google, and then they tried to move it to Google's platform, and they didn't really mind, and then it died, and then it's really sad. And
sorry, I was just going to say, I used Jaiku years ago, and I got to know some of the guys who built it, and they basically Google bought it just for the people and not the thing. They didn't want Jaiku. They wanted the people to build Google Wave, which went tits up, and then they wanted Google Plus and all this. Now, basically, the same people are now building Google Plus. I think it's still out there.
Well, you mentioned several times about businesses being built up and then selling out, and there was a bit of talk in the media about how kind of way do you, or is it just the quality of businesses in
I definitely think it's. I mean, I grew up in Scotland, but I'm actually American, and we were saying that we don't have a culture of failure here. It's celebrating failure, and it's really it makes it hard.
Is it the failure?
The thing is, in America you've got this notion, you know, that it's all about trying. It's not necessarily about succeeding; it's about trying. And actually, you've got that's why you've got.
But once you've got to the point and then got sold by and sell out to Google, Microsoft, or whoever, then it's not that you haven't tried. You've tried very well, and you've made a load of cash. I think the problem we have is we have a lack of ambition.
Yeah.
Like you get like Facebook is massive. And there were so many times when Facebook could have been sold for huge amounts of money, but didn't, because they were like, no, but actually, your huge offer of cash is great, but we think we're going to do better.
I'm talking about on a lower level, because I mean, the thing is, Jaiku was actually reasonably well funded to begin with. But in the UK, I mean, you know, I know that last time died a little bit. They were, but the number of case studies we've got for really, really big things coming from the UK is absolutely disproportionate to the amount of talent we've got.
I feel quite strongly that we have there's a cultural problem within the UK, and I think it comes from the idea of risk. When I was growing up, it was if you wanted to set up your own business, you had to put something on the table. It was like, if you believe in your business, you have to put your house. It's like you have to put your house on the line. There's got to be some surety for you that's there. And I think that's endemic in the way that money is invested. I think it plays out in the way money is invested in this country. So there is this kind of high barrier to innovation in a sense, because so you can't get money unless you put something down. You actually put your money where your mouth is. You risk your house. You risk your family livelihood. And that is a real barrier.
Absolutely.
And it does not. I don't think that happens. It happens to the same extent.
It's about scarcity, and different things are scarce here than they're scarce in the US. So it's less of a barrier in the US because there are more options to find jobs in the house.
The US don't get as many grants. The US is like it's all or nothing, isn't it?
The US does.
I think in this country it's a bit of flux.
The US spends far more of the public budget on supporting technology, but it just doesn't do it the same way. It invests in things like DARPA, which are big agencies, but they spill out ideas in a different way.
Yeah.
They don't try and give micro grants to people through a myriad of public bodies in the same way. But don't imagine that all that stuff comes out of the States because they're much better entrepreneurs than the UK. The system works differently on a different scale through a different model, and I think that's really what you've done.
And yet the stats would actually contradict that, really, because most of the startups start with their own cash in the States, then credit cards, and then borrowings from family, and then small bank loans outside.
But the basis of the technology that's around to play with is different. It's like the Israeli model. There's tons of stuff that happens in Israel, not because the Israelis are better engineers than people in the UK or the US, because the military invests in shitloads of stuff, and that stuff spills out. It's with all of these things, everybody tries to measure it in straight lines, and actually what it is a series of spillovers, and it sort of brings us back to the open source conversation, where public agencies try and do things deliberately. And I put my hand up, I was part of one for 5 years, and I know that this is how it works. You very, very rarely hit the target. Where you give the money or give the resource to groups of people, they normally use it much, much more effectively because they spread it out amongst people who actually can do something with it. But it's finding those mechanisms and then measuring the benefit of it in a public benefit way is much, much harder than having a vertically integrated program of delivery to a specific end.
I mean, a couple of things, but that doesn't come back to the point about big businesses. I mean, we do have some big, Vodafone,
autonomy's not done badly.
Global business network, I mean,
they're not
solid
business anymore.
They
They've sold out.
They did well as a British business, didn't they?
Until they sold out, and they always do. We don't have those big. Microsoft didn't sell out to anybody. Google didn't sell out to anybody. Facebook didn't sell out to anybody. Whereas there are a raft of
definitely ambition,
and there are lots and lots of startups in Cambridge that I watched, and they all sold out to somebody.
They never have in their plan. Once they've got a couple of years in and they're doing reasonably well, they don't deliberately have a plan to beat American companies and take over American companies.
I say the vast majority of Silicon Valley companies are exactly the same, but there are some standouts. Most of them are looking for the payout. Most of them want the payday.
Well, Skype is half British. I mean, it is. It's an Anglo-Estonian partnership. I mean, Skype changed the world.
But it's been bought by Microsoft. And that's sold out.
Yeah, they sold it twice, though, to be fair. They got paid twice for the same thing. That's canon. I like that.
I mentioned Jagex, but that's I mean, for me, because I've worked in a company where before Foursquare was even an idea. There's this thing you can register where you are, and we locatedness back when there was only like one smartphone, and we were experimenting with that, saying it's going to be big soon. Let's start building it now. We've got it now. Let's launch it. When Foursquare was just a placeholder and no technology, just marketing. And the boss at the time said, well, no. Well, the thing is that what's going to happen is it's going to be Silicon Valley. So we could invest loads of time, bet the house, bet the business, to go at this massively. In the end, lose the business because it'll end up going to Silicon Valley.
Foursquare's in New York, which is at least as good as London.
And to be fair with Foursquare, it was his third time to try it. He was too early for the first time, he was too early the second time, but he's obsessed with it. And the third time, he was at the right time because there were enough smartphones distributed around the community to make it big enough. So it was his third go at exactly the same thing.
And exactly, so it doesn't, and that's the thing, though, that perhaps, sometimes it's a good idea to at least do a little bit of that, take those ideas and run with them a bit, because sometimes an organisation in York can do it. And I would like to believe that the reason why you helped me out back in the day is the idea that if we could build a set, well, like 4 months ago,
that's internet time.
Is because that if we can build the sector in Liverpool, then that will increase the amount of attention on Liverpool and build that network of people supporting each other.
Well, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, all of us just going anywhere and meeting anyone who's interested in, you know.
Can we extend that to
Manchester?
Can I just say something? When there's an art thing a few years back that was called Transpennine, like an exhibition that linked up cities, do you know what I mean? Like Julian, you said you're in Manchester. I know people like in Sheffield and Leeds and Hull, do you know what I mean? All northern cities. I think between everyone in this room, we all know people that are in the north of the country that you don't necessarily need to go down to London. You don't need London.
Yeah, you do. It's a massive circuit investment.
Take their money and come back.
Depends if you need the investment or not, but if you do, then you know they're only 2 hours away. I mean, I was down in London last week. Like, I'm regularly hanging out in Silicon Roundabout and stuff, just because there are people down there, and doing work for Maxbeck who are based in Silicon Roundabout. So
it's half the time from here to London, they just go from here to Sunderland.
Yeah. It really sort of there's two things. One, it really depends what you're trying to do. You know, but two, in terms of the lack of ambition and all that, or see, I mean, frankly, if you as a first-time entrepreneur can make a living doing what it is that you're doing, right? I mean, so forget study, right? Actually, just having an idea, starting a business, hiring some folk as and when, right? And actually being able to do that to begin with, that's hard, right? Getting to employee one, right, is actually the hardest thing. Because I was 23 when we hired our first person, right? There were three founders. And when we hired that first person, it meant that we actually had to pay them. Right? They were, and I can't remember what it was, but it totally transforms the whole thing. So actually just getting into that space, never mind getting into we're going to take over the world of Sky, is just convincing people that you're going to, you're really trying, if you're in music, it's, and even 20 years, I was a music journalist before I did all this. I have 150 bands I interviewed, including people like Kurt Cobain. 4 of them actually made a living, actually doing their music full time. Right? And that includes some fairly big name bands at the time. Right? And if you can get to that point, then you can start thinking about whether you're going to conquer the universe. It's good having a milestone.
I think there's 2 different things. Yes, that's one side of it, but there are businesses, particularly with the cost of entry to some things. You should be looking at global scale straight away because you can serve it with the current technology.
You have to look over here, definitely.
Yeah.
But the things you still have to.
But there are going to be some startups where the path is automatically go global. Don't go local. Don't try to be the biggest in Liverpool or the biggest in London or the biggest in Britain or the biggest in maybe France. Look to be the best at what you're doing globally, if that is the particular sector you're in.
But isn't the danger of it? You could just be the biggest in your own imagination, unless you just do it. Then it'll just be.
Well, you've always got to be moving towards something.
Actually, just going out there and building a business and trying to get stuff done and trying to get to the point where you actually can.
Yeah, but it's absolutely pointless if you do that and then you sell out to a US company and it gets destroyed. You may as well not bother. You may as well supply.
But doesn't the lower barrier of entry? I mean, compared to when I first started a company, the lower barrier, the cost of doing things now. There are in certain industries that by lowering that earlier barrier, it's less likely that there's more of a chance that some people will be going to grow a company. They won't have to sell out, that they haven't taken VC money early on to get some things now that you can do practically for free. You have to take huge VC money just to get it off the ground. And you have to sell because in 3 years they wanted their 40% per annum return. And you had to sell. You had no choice. And in fact, you didn't own even half the company anymore. And you're being marginalised. If you didn't sell now, you're going to end up with nothing.
Well, the thing is, what happens is you get replaced. These companies can replace you because they have the majority shareholding in you.
And in some instances, when a company stops being a startup and becomes a company, and it becomes something that you're turning the ratchet on, a lot of the founders, in many instances, the founders don't necessarily want to be the CEO of that company. They're not ideally suited. They're ideally to go into setting up another company, and they'd be happier doing it.
It depends what you're trying to build.
It depends what you're trying to build. But there's no one size fits all.
is just the kind of like, I want to make a lot of money by building a company and selling
No,
it, then like, yeah, go do whatever you want with that.
go work in the city and play.
Yeah,
play
exactly.
and money.
Don't mind
You
it,
should-
don't
you should be-
mind it if it-
Entrepreneurship is hard. 99% of it is
Yeah.
soul destroying and difficult.
So you need
And
to be
you're
doing
very
it for
unlikely to
something you
succeed.
care about.
You're an idiot
which-
if you go into it.
But once you care about it,
Yeah.
then you get to that point where you're not just worried about how much money the company makes in the end of it. And if you sell, then you lose control over what you're trying to build with that.
If you've got the control of whether you can sell or not, then no. And
Yeah,
if you haven't
which
achieved,
is why I haven't got any VC funding and I'm
Yeah,
being
I
a
agree with-
bootstrap
I agree with
I'm
you.
giving up any of that control. But
Yeah.
I'm atypical.
I love arguing
have
with you,
been
AJ,
through
because
it
I
once.
usually agree with you entirely, and we argue about how we agree with each other. Yeah, I agree.
Talking about arguing with Adrian. What's wrong with soft funding, Adrian? And why can't we take advantage of some things like the technology strategy board, which
We've
is
only
there?
got 5 minutes before it's going to finish. We haven't got time for me to rant about soft funding.
Strings
I think it's a good idea.
It's the strings attached, and the way they
Yeah.
funnel you in a particular direction that might not actually be what's best for your company or for you to deliver your goal.
But to get back to the open source idea, isn't the trick, wherever it comes from, whether it's customers' money, which is obviously the best kind, or soft funding, or VC money, the point is, at an early stage, before you've got the product to the market that you want to get it to, or the product to the stage you want to get it to sell to somebody else that's going to take the market, you need to find ways of getting resource into your business that you don't own. And you've got to find ways of harnessing and controlling it. That's the trick about doing entrepreneurialism, whether you prefix it with open source or not. Nobody, unless they come at this with private wealth, can do that without some kind of collaboration with other people who need to give a little in order to get some benefit back for themselves.
And actually, just having a pool of talent that you can actually pull on. Say there's half a dozen startups and you've each got this much, right? And you know what the key people are that you need to actually get that done. But they're, so you've got the 1, 2, 3 person sort of thing, but maybe one of them is more UX heavy, one of them's more dev heavy, one of them's more retail or e-tail, or it's actually looking at different types of startups, appreciating the kind of resources that they've got, and knowing that they're not necessarily, those people aren't going to necessarily be entirely utilised, and coming up with a way that actually potentially you can start funding
It's also the serendipity that two of those siloed little companies might come together. So they realise, even if it's neither of their ideas together, they can create something completely different.
Yeah. Can I just bring this back? And I think we touched on it. It's like the idea of where ideas come from that help build good products. And I think there's this. I've talked about it before. This idea of a low barrier to innovation is kind of spaces such as does and Mad Lab, is that allows people to play around with ideas. If you've got a space where you're allowing people to create ideas and hit off each other, you're more likely to have an idea that will kind of spring out of that. But because it's a low barrier to entry to the innovation process, if it fails, it doesn't really matter because there's not much risk, because it's a very collaborative space. And I think for more innovation, more entrepreneurialism to kind of take hold, to create an ecosystem, we have to have more spaces like that. Because I don't think it's going to happen.
I had a recent experience of that people through Jelly and through Does just finding subcontracting work. So, loads of times recently in the last few weeks, like just people just connecting and therefore being able to get that little bit of cash that allows them to survive and work on their main idea.
In '96, we did obviously the first thing we had a very cool building, and Ninja Tune was in our building, and a big space because a unit on the ground floor just opened up, and we had all these mad developers and musicians and artists coming in to see what the web was all about, and we couldn't get any work done. So we actually created a cyber cafe at Wim. But actually, it was one of the original hack spaces, and before they were called hack spaces, the backspace. And what was great there is the number of projects that actually came out of just people going and hanging out there and being free and open. And when you talk about the London thing, right? At the moment the big thing in London is hubs, right? So you've got 1,000,001 set up hubs. If you ever actually go to these places, well, they're fucking horrible. right? There's actually a lot of them. I'm not saying all of them, but a lot of them, right? You go in, and it's not. They're not a bunch of people sitting around chatting about stuff they're doing. It's actually just. It's kind of like they're like a telesales. You know, it's like telesales where you've got a row of folk with laptops and headphones, and people not actually talking to each other because actually they're there to work. And I've had so many conversations recently with folks that they're talking, you know, that are working in those spaces or getting out there, and it's it is the key thing. It's actually having an open forum like this, right, where people can actually talk with impunity and actually talk about their ideas. And so I haven't been in your space, but it sounds like the right environment.
Hopefully worse than what. We'll come down in kind of an hour or so when we're running Maker Night. Play with 3D printers and lasers and things.
Whatever Pan Am is. But yeah, I think it's this key thing is making a. One of my spaces really get different types of session, right? Because if you just get devs hanging out, because we had the Foundry up until, you know, and that was where all the developers hung out in Shoreditch, right, until. And it's just full developers. You know, where you want somewhere where the designers and the commercial folk and finding some sort of neutral ground where people aren't going to fight with each other and actually are willing to actually try and understand what each other does. And I think in 2012, I mean, it was hard enough, you know, 12 years ago, but now there's no excuse. We're all in the digital world. We all live in the startup world. We all know what these things are. You know, it's up to us whether we choose to actually communicate with people in a way that's open. Or exclude somebody by using jargon that they don't understand.
I just think that that's so important. I can't remember it offhand, but I think I mentioned it to you. There's a quote from John Stuart Mill, 1845, right at the end of and at the peak of the Industrial Revolution, and he sort of said something to the effect that there can be nothing more important than the meeting people with dissimilar attitudes and dissimilarity, because that's the absolute core of that's taken us to where we are now. And that's
there was a report into why Silicon Valley was so successful. Japanese trying to rep Silicon Valley, and then did a report to why it's successful. They actually flipped it back to its education policy in before that. So and they saw that actually there was a lot of artists and writers and types going into and then being sucked into the burgeoning kind of technology scene, and that those kind of skills, those kind of talents, that kind of thinking really melded into the technology side to create that explosion. A similar study, which I could actually point out, Munich, why Munich's taken off in Germany, as a similar kind of hub. And it's the same kind of thing, the strong, the arts and strong kind of social policies are actually fed into a very strong industrial technology-based boom, and that we need to sort of support the archetypes even if they might not support us.
Yeah, but they're still quite monosyllabic. I mean, I think the thing that people miss is that actually, to me, it's all about respect. Right? Is that even if you don't understand what somebody does, taking the time to understand, to listen, to learn about what they are. When I started out, I was sitting in these rooms with a whole bunch of advertising folk, and I did not know what they were talking about, and I was the geek in the corner. And they were saying, you know, whenever there was a tech question, this is 1995, so it's a while back. But you know, they're talking about ABC One this and I'm thinking, well, sorry, you're talking a language I don't get. And actually, I'm spending a lot of time trying to explain things really simply to you. And having to go through that with advertising, with media, with PR, with direct. I know all the syntax. All it is syntax. They're actually all really simple concepts. They create words to just keep people out. You know, and actually, once you kind of get that, you know, and we've been in the ghetto for so long. You know, so all right, don't worry about tech. It'll just work. But if you can actually foster an environment where people actually do get to I mean, I've learned so much about filmmaking this year, and last year. Worked on a campaign called Unwatchable. It's all about rape in the Congo, and quite mad actually. And looking at the skill behind all that, I was dismissed quite a lot. Actually, I now understand the industry because I listened. They'll learn, and if you, and those are the
What's the
people,
name of that? Sorry, that film that you...
unwatchable. If you, it's unwatchable.cc. All this Stop Coney stuff makes me a bit sick because it's all about the same issue.
That's really offensive use. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, by the way, unwatchable, not safe for work. It's a nice Middle English family getting raped and murdered by soldiers.
Shall we? I think we all need to go off and make cool stuff with Arduinos, or get drunk down the Pan Am on free drink. So one of the two options. Shall we just first of all, can I just mention to people who haven't been to the Does Liverpool space, which is on just you can find it Does Liverpool. Probably everyone knows it, don't they? Where is it? People I recognise. Does Liverpool? It's on.
It's in the Gosling building on doesliverpool.com.
And it is rather wonderful, and there's some great spin-out events from that. And although I'm not going to go to that one, I'm going to go to the games thing. They have games and free alcohol.
We've got a 3D printer and a laser cutter. What could be cool? I've got a laser. Would you make your own alcohol? Not yet.
Arduino still yet.
Can I just say, if anybody wants to get in touch with me, if you can just write down my name correctly, and then go to LinkedIn. It's JONBAINS.
Beautifully.
Baines. Spelled brains without the R. JONBAINS. And anybody wants to link in, feel free. I don't give out cards anymore because they're.
Alternatively, you can take one of my cards and I'll give you his details.
Does anyone else want to have any closing? I think we'll take 5 minutes for closing this, or should we just...
Can I mention something? I don't know how relevant it is, or it just might be my particular input, which might not necessarily be right. You know what I'm saying about British culture and how there's a lot of... Because a lot of my friends, I've been in a band and involved in music and media for years, and different kinds, or on both sides, have seen it's been quite an interesting journey. I wasn't really planning that way. I didn't have any plan, but always when I was a kid I liked music and media, and that's kind of what I've gravitated towards from being in a band to doing radio. So but a lot of my friends who work in court, they're just trying to get money to get by, to pay the rent, most people, and they're pretty much have quite a lot of respect for them because they're very, very great and they're very talented. However, just bubbling by working for Vodafone in a call centre, because they want to, because it's not trap, but it's a necessary. But do you think a lot of people young people in Britain, I'm nearly 40 now, are put off by the business world because they may have a perception of it being unpleasant, lots of money in tax and all the things that, because you kind of see what's happening now with the UK and cut. I know that's but it can be like, I don't want to get into that world. Yeah, I'm out of work. Yeah. I'm on capacity benefit. But I often have the discussion that going against the grain in this country can cause mental illness. But that's a different theory that needs a lot of discussion. But because I have had a lot of problems in business, but I was just a stage. I was working within advertising, which can be terrible when you actually start questioning your superiors.
Well, should we say then? Okay. Does business
Sorry,
have a bit of a problem? Because we need to go get free booze. Yeah, so does business have a bit of an image problem?
Yeah, that's it.
Some sorts of image, some sorts of business, and I suppose that's part of what I'd like to see Does doing is kind of just showing more people, because I think a lot of it is you just see people doing stuff and you kind of go, well, actually I've bumped into him and had a chat and stuff, and he's not that different. Like, I could do that sort of stuff that he's doing. He's not this special. That's one of the problems I think I had with the GEC some level, and the people on stage were Richard Branson, Michael Heseltine, Terry Lee, and they're all like big names, and you can look at them and go, well, okay, yeah, Richard Branson's done really well, but you're not going to get that kind of connection. I think a lot more useful for kind of bootstrapping kind of entrepreneurialism in the city would be if you got to bump into people who were running businesses and chat to them and find out that actually they're not that special. There's nothing bad. It's hard, but like,
and they'll probably help you as well.
It's not that hard.
And they'll probably help you as well. Brilliant. Isn't that a great note to end on?
Oh,
sorry,
that's
that's
sorry,
sorry.
no, I was just going to say, I completely get your point. I do believe that to a lot of people, that having your own business is just not an option.
Yeah.
It's just not. It's just they don't consider that it's for them or it's been
Because
bred
there's a
out.
lot of stress and anxiety, which I've been told in my life by medical professions to minimise. And so it's like, you know, I want to go and do thousands of things, but I'm under strict instructions about all sort of don't. But you find I find my way into things like this, and you just, you know, I don't know. Hopefully, I can manage that and become new opportunities.
Sometimes it's different. So
That's good to reiterate.
Yeah.
And if you listen to some of the advice that was given out from Branson, you know, on the 13th, you know, it was get yourself a really great idea. Yeah, sounds good. Get lots and lots of debt on board. Yeah, really go for it. Yeah, and everything will be good.
And open your bank account.
That was just about it. You know.
Right now is actually a very good time to actually meeting people outside the digital universe because they're all scared because they're feeling like they're becoming obsolete. So actually, what was happening in the past where you were looked down on, now actually to get to be up there and actually all the industries that are essential to actually doing a big startup-y type thing, they're all looking for folk who really know what they're talking about and are much more willing to listen and much more willing to discuss than were before. So just saying that's a good time to get a little bit further afield and